It has been started now.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program of ICHRRF, which stands for International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. We are starting with our Fellowship Training Program seminar. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the executive team of the ICHRRF, I invite all our audience members to yet another seminar in this seminar training program. Our distinguished faculty include Professor Ved P. Nanda, Professor Yashwant Pathak, and Professor Nalini Rao, Professor Lavanya Vemsani, myself, Mr. Clements, Mr. Hardam Tripathi, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, Professor Nidhi Shendurnikar, and Professor Sen Ni. We have two fellows now, Mr. Pachauri, who joined in January of 2022, and Anushree Ghisad, who joined from July of 2022 batch. Ripudaman Pachauri was supposed to finish on December 31st, but he has requested an extension for 4 months that has been granted to allow him to complete his research project. So we still have two fellows. Our seminar has a standard format. First 25 years, there's a presentation by the fellow. Usually, if Professor Nanda is present, he likes to give 10 minutes comments. And this is followed by 25 minutes discussion by the faculty preceptor. And last 30 minutes go on question and answer session. The topic of today's seminar is persecution of Maori people by European colonizers in New Zealand. And just for sake of record, today is Friday, January 6, 2023. Time is 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but for Anushree, who is joining from India, the time is 7:30 a.m. on Saturday morning. Announcements, we are still having pending applications for January 2023 sessions. Hopefully with some help from Professor Rao, we had selected a fellow for deferred enrollment. He might join because he has finished his bachelor's degree. We are also inviting volunteer faculty, so if anybody is interested in joining, please do so. There are some housekeeping rules. Please stay on the mute to avoid noise interference. Change your cell phone setting to vibration mode. When a fellow or the faculty preceptor are speaking, please don't interrupt them. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves are allowed to ask questions. All the questions have to be moderated and sent through chat function. Questions should be very precise and specific. We don't want lengthy monologues in the form of questions. And lastly, this session is being recorded and it will be available on our website as well as on YouTube channel within 24 hours. So without further ado, I will invite today's presenter, Anushree Ghisad. She will make the presentation. Go ahead, Anushree.
Dhanyavad Adityanji. Please allow me to share my screen. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Namaskar, everyone. Today I shall be speaking on persecution of Maori people by European colonizers in New Zealand. So this is my presentation layout. Today I have divided my presentation in three broad segments. The first segment will deal with history of colonization in New Zealand. What has made Maoris a minority in their own homeland? We need to know that. Second segment will shed light on the ongoing ramifications of European colonization And the third segment of this presentation will delve into irreversible damages that are caused to Maori culture due to colonization. So let me begin without any further ado. So today we are going to discuss about New Zealand, right? So let me ask you two questions at the very onset. Who discovered New Zealand? And how was Queen Elizabeth of the UK welcomed in New Zealand whenever she visited that country? Now see, answers to these questions determine how much have we given in for an Eurocentric discourse of the world history. Besides justifying colonial excesses, the incessant propagation and repetition of Eurocentric discourse normalizes historical inaccuracies. One such inaccuracy being James Cook, the British navigator, or Tasman, the Dutch navigator. These people have discovered New Zealand. Now, if you also believe that, you are mistaken. Before Europeans colonized it, this land was inhabited by ancient tribal dwellers called Maoris. Now, according to Maoris, a person named Kupe was the first Polynesian to discover this land. That time there was no human population on this land. Kupe called this land Aotearoa. So this is the original name of New Zealand. And people from his tribe settled in this place in 750 AD. So James Cook comes into picture about 1000 years later. Now for my second question, if you assume that the British monarch was always welcomed with flowers and bouquets whenever she arrived in New Zealand, you are again mistaken. See this timeline. In 1981, Queen Elizabeth survived an assassination attempt in New Zealand. In 1986, two women posing as official wardens, they pelted eggs at Queen. And in 1990, Queen faced agitated protesters. One of the protesters actually threw a wet black t-shirt upon her arrival. Why could people of New Zealand possibly detest the British crown this much? These are natives of Aotearoa. They were colonized in their own homeland by British. So it is important for us to understand why they were colonized, how they were colonized, to fully understand what actually pans out when it comes to a conflict between a materially driven expansionist society and a spiritually driven native tradition. And that takes me to the history. So how it all began. I'll just quickly run you through this history in 2 minutes. A Dutch navigator named Tasman, he was given a mandate to discover new lands in Farsi. So he was the first European to reach Aotearoa in 1642. Underline this, he was the first European to reach that place and not to discover it. These are two completely different things, to reach and to discover it. He named this land as New Zealand. Now, Maoris objected his presence. They gave a tough fight to Tasman and his team, and Tasman and his team had to actually leave. So does it mean that Europeans abandoned New Zealand? Absolutely not. News of discovery of new land spread like a wildfire in Europe. Now, that time, many countries in Europe were already colonizing different parts of the world. So other colonial powers in Europe started eyeing New Zealand. 127 years after Tasman, a British navigator, James Cook, he explored New Zealand. Now his expedition started scramble for New Zealand. And what was this scramble for? To secure more land. France and Britain, they were at the forefront of this competition, but ultimately Britain succeeded. Now Maoris were certainly not happy with this colonization and land grab. They fought with British from 1810 to 1813, what is called Musket Wars. See, British came with all modern fighting skills and divide and rule policy. Thousands of Maoris were killed, thousands of Maoris were enslaved, and remaining started abandoning the place. And this is how British settled its own people in New Zealand and populated this land. This led to what I call minoritization of a native majority in its homeland. Soon, British formed government in New Zealand. They signed the infamous Treaty of Waitangi with Maori landholders. This was in 1840. Now, this treaty deliberately misinterpreted it was deliberately misinterpreted by the Crown to forward its agenda of land grab. And that is how Maoris, the land-holding community of New Zealand, became the bonded laborers in its own country. Now see, some people may argue that this is all in past. Colonization was also followed by decolonization, and that was happening world over. And actually, it is true for New Zealand also. This country gained complete independence from Crown in 2003 after abolition of Judicial Committee of Privy Council. But what does this independence mean to native Maori people? Does the colonization affect them even today? So the prevalent notion of New Zealand is it is a modern, developed and egalitarian country. Now, what I'm going to do in the next part of my presentation is to enlist some of the prevalent notions about New Zealand and one by one dissect them through Maori lens. Maori lens will shed light on glaring anomalies of the society. By the way, this is the drawing of one of the artists in Tasman's team. And this is what is the first impression of Europeans of New Zealand. So coming to second part of our presentation, let me enlist four what I call glaring anomalies. So the first prevalent notion about New Zealand is that New Zealand is an agriculture wonder. And that is true also in a way that agriculture is the largest sector of tradable economy. It constitutes 80% of the country's import. If you have to assess this claim through Maori lens, see, Maoris have very intimate relationship with land. They consider their land to be sacred. Now, Europeans logged and burned off 1/3 of forest to convert it into farming. So this Treaty of Waitangi of 1848 impacted disastrously on Maori agriculture. Now, fast forward it to 1920, government funded consolidation of Maori land into economic farms actually did support a very small minority of Maoris. Even when the Waitangi Tribunal recommended that the privately owned land be returned to Maoris, many federated farmers of New Zealand opposed this tooth and nail. And also, whatever little land that was given back to Maoris is already degraded by pests and weeds, and that makes farming very difficult. Another thing, ancient Maori land lease was reviewed in 1998 after passing the Crown Pastoral Land Act. Now see, environmentalists and academics have raised concern that in this review, the land conservation issue is not addressed. Now the question is, who degraded the land in the very first place? The colonizers. Now those colonizers who snatched this land away from Maoris, they are putting onus back on Maoris for land conservation. So Maori elders feel that the environmentalist, academics, and even government is using the tenure review process to lock the land up for conservation purposes. And in the entire process, there is zero regard for the indigenous land rights of Maori farmers. Coming to second anomaly, prevalent notion about New Zealand is that New Zealand is forerunner of women's right. So in reality, New Zealand secured women's vote right in 1893, and this is way before other Western countries. Now, if we have to look at from Maori lens, women suffered severe oppression after colonization. I'm talking of Maori women. So back in 19th century, Women's Christian Temperance Union, this was the organization which was spearheading the suffrage movement. Now, this is a movement for securing equal rights. Okay. Now, do you know what was the condition they put for Maori women if these women wish to join this movement? That the Maori women will have to sign agreement that they will give up their ancestral sacred markings. You can actually see sacred markings on body of Maori women, that they will give up these markings if they wish to join this. So, today the same colonizers talk about celebrating diversity, but just 130 years ago, this was the extent of inclusivity and accommodation. Now see, traditionally Maori female elders, they were repositories of sacred knowledge. Now this is the time when women in Britain were restricted from even attending school. At the time of Treaty of Waitangi, 1840, Maori women were significant landholders. They were fighters, navigators, spiritual and political leaders. But the colonial land tenure system disproportionately affected them. Colonial misogyny was actually unable to fathom that how come a woman could occupy such a respectable status in a society. So they actually inhibited the already fraught process of native land courts. And this actually disempowered Maori women economically, politically, and socially. Even before this treaty, women were at the heart of Maori social organizations. So the disruption of social organization was a vital step in colonial process, and the oppression of women was the fastest route to destabilize this unit. Now, another feature of colonial rule was rape. Yes, rape. Rape featured in colonization of New Zealand throughout its history. It occurred at the hands of Cook's crew. So Cook's crew, in various voyages report, they have actually noted that they had sex with locals, including rape of girls as young as 9 years old, and that was incredibly common. It was actually used as a tool of land war at various places in New Zealand. So point is, how does it all affect Maori women today? Today, Maori women, they represent 65% of the female prison population in New Zealand. And imagine total share of Maori population is 14.1% of the total population of New Zealand. Imagine how it affects the socio-educational life of these women and their families. These women still continue to be underpaid in work and they face hindrance in healthcare system. Coming to our third glaring anomaly, the prevalent notion about New Zealand is that it's a very happy country. And actually this claim is supported by data. World Happiness Index of 2022, it places New Zealand on 10th rank with a score of 7.3 out of 10. And this is considered to be quite a good score. So one traveling news channel has described New Zealand as, or this is what it has to say about New Zealand, that Kiwis are famously happy people, they are very friendly people, their happiness stems from satisfaction in workplace and social sphere. Okay, fair enough, right? But is this applicable to Maori people? So despite the idyllic image of New Zealand that we have, in reality, this country hides many problems. And that includes numerous Maori gangs that have sprung up in the wake of radical economic reforms. So in this context, Maori youths have started taking refuge in these gangs. Why gangs? Because for them, gangs substitute family. Gangs give them status, security, and that also includes consumption of drugs, sale of drugs. Another feature is absent fathers. They have become a commonplace. These absent fathers often turn to alcohol, drug abuse, domestic violence. So, because of all this, Maori communities are uprooted and families have literally collapsed. The families are trapped in cycle of violence and poverty, which becomes further easy for the present day policymakers to tag them as regressive. Also, life expectancy of Maori is shorter than that of general population. So cumulatively, this socio-economic fragility of Maoris explain plight of Maori children also. And that brings me to our next anomaly. The notion is that New Zealand is performing well in child's rights domain. So in realization of children's right, New Zealand is scoring 9.33 out of 10. And 9.33 is again supposed to be a very good score. However, we see that New Zealand is concealing some of the shady areas of children's right, especially when it comes to Maori children. So just take a look at some of these facts. Rate of infanticide in New Zealand is 4 per 1,000 live births, which is one of the largest within OECD countries. And Maori children constitute high proportion of this infanticide. No, I can actually provide statistics when it comes to question answer session. I have to bind by the time limit. Maori children are clearly discriminated against when it comes to education. Majority of them do not even have access to normal education system despite government efforts. Now see this, government actually started child welfare agency. Under this, government takes affected Maori children and newborns into state care. Now, see the statistics, the population share of Maoris is 14.1%, while over 50% of Maori children are in state care, 50%. The government may have intentions of protecting the kids, but Maori people cite that the family and community are important for child's holistic upbringing. Hence, Maori elders are deeply disturbed by this routine removal of Maori children. Removing children from their families and then supposedly brainwashing them, it creates rift within the family. It also creates fleet of angry and disgruntled Maori children, many of whom do not even find any merit in honoring their traditional way of life. Lastly, human rights advocates say that the intervention in Maori families wreak racism and a dark colonial legacy. So, 6 years ago, an open letter titled Hands Off Our Tamariki was signed by over 17,000 people. Tamariki in Maori language means children. So, you can see that petition website here in the picture. It says that state needs to stop abuse of Maori children and let Maoris make a decision regarding welfare of their children. So in 2019, the Children's Commissioner, his name was Judge Andrew Beecroft, he launched an investigation into Child Welfare Agency. Take a look at what he had to say. Note this, our enduring legacy of colonization and contemporary systematic racism has long affected decisions made by not only child welfare services, but all New Zealand agencies for decades. There's no getting away from it. Point is, what do these anomalies show? That to this day, for all practical, anthropological, social, environmental, historical purposes, world continues to see New Zealand through the same Eurocentric lens, through the same colonial lens. I call it colonial lens because the prevalent notions of New Zealand hardly factor in ground realities of Maoris. This reality is not amplified enough. And why is that the case? Because Maoris constitute 14.1% of total population, a native majority which is turned into minority in its own ancestral homeland. That brings me to the third part of the presentation, which is the last part. Can colonial wrongs be reversed? So often in media, New Zealand is projected to be decades ahead of other countries in dealing with its colonial past. And in all fairness, that could be true to some extent. Government has taken steps, although these steps were taken after intense protest from Maoris. Waitangi Tribunal was formed as a permanent commission of inquiry. This was in 75. In 1987, Maori language became official languages. Many other things happened since then. When it comes to this Waitangi Tribunal, the settlement policy within this tribunal aims to achieve full and final settlement of historical injustices. My question is, can the historical injustice be totally undone? Unfortunately not. Firstly, because no amount of money can undo the wrongs of the past. And secondly, many damages by colonizers are totally irreversible in nature. They are intangible. No amount of treaty settlement can undo it. And allow me to enlist two such ramifications. The first ramification has to deal with impact of conversion to Christianity on Maori people. So traditional Maori religion or traditional Maori faith would be the accurate word, is a pre-European belief system. Within this belief system, Maori regarded that all things possess a life force called Maori. And this way of life was completely in sync with the cosmic order. Now, fast forwarded to 1814, when Christianity arrived in New Zealand through Church Missionary Society. Within first 35 years itself, around 60% Maoris converted to Christianity. So this process started almost 9 generations ago. By 2018, close to 40% Maoris identify themselves as Christians. So what does this mean? This leads to dilution of Maori beliefs. How? Because converted Maoris are trained to operate within the framework of Christian religion. Now, this framework is globally dominant, and the government of New Zealand also operates within the same framework. So the ecosystem around has made it a very aspirational framework to fall within, because it is promoted as very modern and progressive. Unfortunately, this framework does not accommodate evolution of Maori faith, which is based on wisdom of ancestors and passed down orally, and even the traditional tribal hierarchy within the system. It is not codified the way Christian framework is. So within this setup and this system, the converted Maoris are automatically distancing themselves from their ancient tradition-based way of life. We have a very small number of Maoris who are non-converted, and they face threefold challenge. Ek to they have to preserve the native tradition. That is the major challenge. Secondly, they have to fight colonial legacy of superiority, which is still lingering. And thirdly, they have to convince the converts from within Maori faith to honor ancient tradition. Now, another problem is, due to Christianization, appropriation of Maori traditions has also happened. So, for example, the traditional Maori prayers are being replaced by Christian prayers. And now every public gathering of Maoris is expected to begin with Christian prayers, and it is expected to end that way also. See, the risk lies in dilution of the spiritual core of Maori tradition. And that has already started happening. This spiritual injustice is compounded by converts from within the tradition, which is difficult to diagnose and difficult to confront. And another such intangible, near irreversible damage is the academic and policy bias, which stems from misrepresentation of Maori values. So, see, much of the discourse around Maoris prior to European colonization have been obscured through early Eurocentric anthropological perspective. Now, this perspective either misperceived or deliberately misinterpreted or simply erased the presence of Maoris. This discourse usually paints Maoris as pagans, uncivilized, barbaric, and that is how they end up justifying colonization. So, according to scholar Aroha Yates Smith, this colonial lens was inherently misogynistic in nature. This is reflected in their analysis of Maori beliefs. So, for example, the early ethnographers predominantly focused on the male gods of Maoris, and they completely ignore the multitude of female gods, which resulted in the male biased perception of Maori pantheon. There is this anthropologist called Elson West. He literally referred to the most sacred center of Maoris as this, and it is quoted here: this house of misfortune, of ominous inferiority, is represented by this world, by the earth, by the female sex, and by the female organ of generation, which holds dread powers of destruction and pollution. And this person has provided crucial written material of pre-colonial Maoris. This happens to be the baseline for entire world. And this is one such example. There are many more. Now, this feeds into academic bias. This unfortunately leads to normalization of a discourse that Maoris are uncivilized pagans. And since there is no written material available on pre-colonial Maori, at least the one that is available in public domain, such essays of colonial apologists, they have become the reference point for future academics and researchers. This has curated a slave mentality within the educated, rather Christian educated Maoris also, who now attack their own values based on Eurocentric understanding of their own faith. So many non-Maoris believe that the main reason for Maoris' plight lies in the uncouth, tribal and barbaric way of life. Now just tell me, can any tribunal undo this systemic infliction of inferiority complex within the community itself? And that brings me to the last point. The answer to that question is it simply cannot. So let me give you one last example of that legacy which wreaks colonial supremacy at the expense of Maori culture. Now this happened in 2021. So there is a rule that the male member of parliaments in New Zealand parliament can only ask a question in the parliament if they are wearing a tie. Raviri Waititi, he is a leader of Maori party. He was ejected from the parliament for not wearing a tie. It is him in the photo here. The Speaker of the House first prevented him from asking him the question and then ordered him to leave. Now, response of Shri Waititi ji was that I am wearing a Maori business attire. So, technically, MP Waititi was not following the rule of parliament. The rule of parliament being that you have to wear a tie if you have to ask a question. But do you really think that this rule, which is set up by the colonizers, actually accommodate Shri Waititi ji's traditions, culture and his way of life? Waititi has called tie as a colonial nudes. Therefore, he refused to wear a tie and he instead wore a green pendant. Is it not utterly insensitive and inconsiderate to force an elected representative of native people to wear something that reminds him of horrors of colonization? And by the way, this person happens to be the original inhabitant of the land. So this is what Waititi has to say. It's not about ties. It's about cultural identity. And that is it. It is not about a tie. It is about this fetish for colonial subscription in this day and age. It is not about Maoris, because what has happened with Maoris has happened with countless native spiritual traditions that have been mercilessly decimated by colonizers. These traditions continue to face brunt of colonization to this day. And again, this is not about Maoris, because This is not just about Maoris, because this is actually about the spiritual heritage, the one which is in sync with nature's law, with the cosmic law. So it is our collective human heritage. Imagine the collective spiritual loss we have faced since this aggressive colonization has begun. Imagine how much we have been brainwashed through normalization of a discourse that operates within the framework of the victors. It is important to educate ourselves about Maoris, talk about them, and also take a stand for them, because it is the first step in restoring that collective spiritual legacy. Else, we will also end up becoming stooge of that Eurocentric worldview without even knowing, and contribute in its propagation in our own way, which is why it is important to take a stand, and which is why it is important to stand for Maoris. With that, I end my presentation. These are some of the references that I have used. Dhanyavad.
Thank you very much indeed, Anushree ji. Kindly stop sharing your presentation. And we are very fortunate that Professor Nanda joined the seminar today. Usually our standard format is after fellows presentation, Professor Nanda gives some comment. So I'm going to give the floor to Professor Nanda. Kindly unmute yourself, sir.
Aditya namaskar, and namaskar everyone, Anushree ji and Professor Nalini Rao ji, Sadhar namaskar. And I'm so sorry that I could not come earlier. This was a busy day and I just left another program so that at least I could join you. So my apologies. I heard only the last few minutes. And as usual, Anushree ji, it was pretty comprehensive. And what the Christians did and how the colonizers totally trampled upon their rights. I really don't have to add anything. I think what had happened was that a few times I had the opportunity to be with Maori scholars, Maori people who have been in the government at the present time, at least in parliament, and um, talked about the possibility of the changes that are happening and the effort that the government is at least making at the present time to make up for all that past opportunities. So I think on that one, I'm sure that you have looked into it or might look into it, so that where can we go from here? Because with the UN declaration and the effort now in order to have at least a treaty if possible, I think all those efforts are ongoing. And so I simply want to say that wonderful that you did it and presented in a comprehensive fashion. And I'm going to stay to hear Professor Rao and Professor Rao's wisdom. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nanda, for your comments. Now we will invite today's faculty preceptor, Professor Nalini Rao, to give her comments on this particular topic. Professor Nalini Rao, kindly unmute yourself. You are on the mute.
Namaste, Adityanji. Namaste, Nandaji, Dr. Clemens, and Anushree. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. It was very comprehensive, it was detailed, and it rang a bell within all of us about the colonizers. Okay. You especially had a very good point to hold on to the entire presentation, particularly when you began how majority becomes a minority. Okay. And that was a very important statement I thought you made, and gave us as to why you're making this statement. So you began with this understanding of James Cook and how he discovered. But more than that, that did not appeal to me as much as what you said later, that when you gave a very realistic picture of the state of the Maoris today in New Zealand. Okay. And what the colonizers did, and not only that, what they continued to do for a very, very long time, whether it was till 1987. Okay. So the hands of the Maoris were totally tied. Their cultural identity was destroyed on purpose. Okay. Their beliefs and practices were negated and looked down upon as something very primitive. Okay. And they were not able, as you said, socially, politically, economically, they were totally just below their feet, okay, to put it mildly. Okay. That was very shocking to me because whenever we talk about colonization, we're always having a very comparative understanding of colonization, okay, in the whole world. So it rang a bell what happened to what the Spaniards did, what the Portuguese did, what the British did in all different countries. What did they do in Australia? Having been there and seeing the indigenous native culture being brought up and exhibited everywhere in all museums, which is simply so beautiful and meaningful. I have a very big question. Okay, even before I make all the different comments, it has just risen up to my curiosity. What exactly were the beliefs and practices that the Maoris practiced? How did they do the ritual? What did the markings mean on their faces? Right? Just like how the Native American markings meant something, which we understand in terms of art. How can normally, when a culture is tried to be looked upon with respect and a deeper understanding, it is these images that are shown. What can we do today, apart from making treaties that take the Maori imagery that they have, the Maori rituals? I understand they don't have much written language, but even to understand their beliefs about the land, what can we do today? If you can just tell me in brief, it really convinces me that here was a wonderful culture. Even if they believed in the trees or the environment, this should be promoted and incorporated in modern education today. Because as you know, we have students from New Zealand, and I never knew about this. I was under the impression that they're being treated well. Just like when I went to Australia, I got the impression that they're coming up a lot there. Right? So I'm going to just stop here for 1 minute. And if you can just kindly let me know if you know anything about their beliefs.
Anushree, do you want to answer this question right now?
Yes, Adityanji. Thank you, Professor Rao. Actually, I did go through some of the basic Maori beliefs, and that includes a lot of native Maori vocabulary. So it is difficult to remember those exact words at this juncture. Uh, but as I have understood in nutshell, the Maori belief system is weaved around a sacred spirit called Maori. What I have understood as Chetana, parallel within my own culture, which according to them pervades in everything around them, which is why every single creature within that ecosystem is considered to be very sacred. So for example, the land ownership is always collective. It's individual also, but within that individual framework it is collective. And since the belief system is such that if you have to be included, if a person is a part of Maori culture, then he has to be a part of that land holding system also, because that land doesn't represent a piece of soil, it represents a piece of sacred embodiment to them. And actually that is how the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, because within the Treaty of Waitangi, Britishers were believed to be somebody who could take a little piece of land, and through them they were extended an olive branch, but Britishers misinterpreted it as if they could have entire claim on the land. So this comes from a very different approaches and value systems. Now similarly, I have understood that the Maori culture is entirely in sync with what we call today environmental consciousness, and there were many technical terms for it also. As I've said in the presentation, within Maori culture, women at every level of their organizational setup held highest position along with men. And every ritual that I have come across had some or the other kind of spiritual belief behind it. So to answer your question, how one can actually try to, in a way, re-establish it. So with my limited knowledge, I genuinely believe that the level of awareness would finally determine it. And in order to do that, there needs to be more and more literature, there needs to be more and more academic articles, there needs to be more and more conferences like this, so that people would at least get to know that New Zealand had a pre-colonized, a history prior to Christianization and colonization, and a more native way of life, a more native spiritual tradition, which is completely in sync with ecological perspective, was already there, so that it can be protected and preserved. So level of awareness, in my opinion, is the key. Dhanyavad.
Thank you, Anushree. Does anyone else have any questions? Because I don't see any questions in the chat function. We are a very small gathering, so if people have questions, please ask at this point in time. Maybe I will ask Christina, do you have any questions at this time?
Questions, but when the presentation first started, I started recognizing how there was some similarities with how American Indians were treated over the years, with being taught into Christianity and the Trail of Tears and being taken off their land, and then adopting a new religion into their own with some Christian beliefs and some not. And then I was wondering if you would get into that, and then you did. So real nice job of touching base, because I was thinking, yes, I can hear the cultural information coming in, but is there a religious undertone? And there was. You did touch on that, so thank you. I appreciate that.
Adityanji, I think Professor Rao has not completed her discourse, so I think we might also hear from Professor Rao.
Thank
Professor
you.
Rao, I was not sure if you completed, because you asked a question and I thought that was end of your.
Well, the question was very curious to know. The curiosity extends also to all the images that I saw in the first PowerPoint, whether it was a goddess or a god, but that apart, that is to do. I go too ancient. But what I really admired was the women's status and the status of the female and the respect that they were accorded, right? That you told us, and how the woman was the prop in a family, okay, as such. But then later on, how that you talked about children being removed, and what the repercussions of colonization has been in New Zealand. Okay. Well, the repercussions of colonization in other country was tremendous as well. And being a minority, such a small minority, with no language written down, okay, we understand that it was a part of the whole colonizing agenda, propaganda, and so on and so forth, that the Euro-centered way of understanding things were going on. But nearby is Australia. And so can we imagine what was the difference in the way the colonizers did to Australia? And how different was it in New Zealand? Would you have any idea of that?
Anushree, you want to deal with that question, or you would let anyone else answer? Anushree, you are on mute. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry, Professor Rao, can you please repeat that question one more time, if possible?
I was wondering whether you would know a little bit about the difference in the way the colonizers meted out to the indigenous people in Australia, and how different was that in New Zealand? Because I see these indigenous people being given a lot of importance in Australia, and every museum, at every airport, at every station. And so I was thinking, wow, they've been treated so well, and and so on and so forth. Is that the same way that they're doing that in New Zealand as well?
Anushree, if you cannot answer the question, that's okay, because your purview was only to review the situation of persecution of Maori in New Zealand, and we did not actually extend the topic to Australia for you, so I can understand your diffidence in answering that question. Should you wish to, please go ahead. If you don't want to, that's fine. I will handle the question.
Yeah, Professor Rao, there is actually a paucity of knowledge on my part to answer this question and do justice to it.
I think that's a very relevant question, Professor Rao, and I will take a stab at it. If you see the process of colonization, especially European colonization in various parts of the country, the answer to your question has been very aptly given by late Reverend Desmond Tutu, who said, when the white man came, we had the land, they had the Bible. And now we have the Bible and the white man has the land. Okay? So that was a game played all over the world by colonizers. And mind you, they did not call themselves colonizers. They were the settlers. Okay? They were not in the business of colonizing. They were the settlers who were in the process of civilizing the natives.
Right.
Civilizing the barbarians. So they brought the Bible. So there are bi-dimensional process going on. One is a racial colonization of a country, making the majority or the original ethnic inhabitants of that country the minority. Whether you see that in New Zealand, whether you say that in Australia, whether you see that in Canada, you see in North America, what we call USA, or you see in Latin America, shades of European colonizers, whether it was from Britain, Ireland, Scotland, or Dutch, or Spanish, or Portuguese. There was a common theme amongst European colonizers that they take a very high and benign view of themselves, and they didn't call themselves colonizers. They were settlers, they were the discoverers, and they brought Christianity to these lands, to the savage, to the natives. And yes, they had to demonize the culture to foster their sense of cultural and religious superiority. Having much more advanced military means, having much more strategic thinking in terms of war fighting capabilities, they subjugated all the lands. It's the same here. And the same process of colonization was adopted in all these lands. So it's unlikely that there was any distinction between the way Aborigines were treated in Australia is any different from When people in New Zealand, it was the same process. Aborigines were made into minority. Their children were also kidnapped, put in boarding schools and put for adoption, so that the linkages between successive generations, the cultural linkages are broken down. And the next generation of the ethnic minorities is not able to carry out their culture. Anushree talked a lot about, the respect for the feminine gods, the respect of female in the society in original Maori culture. And we say that in New Zealand, the society is very egalitarian and, sort of, about emancipation of women and adult suffrage and all that sort of thing. Now, New Zealand is an extension of Britain and Ireland. And I'm going to share something with you, and I'll tell you how Maori culture was more advanced in treatment of gender equality, and how was the Britishers or Europeans. So everyone can see this slide. This is a picture which is showing wife selling in England.
Wow.
So a man gets, fed up with his wife, was allowed to sell the wife with permission from church as well as the state, which is the kingdom, the queen. This practice was very prevalent in 17th and 18th century in Imperial Britain, and it finally stopped in 1920. Okay, and this was a Christian country. Church of England is the official church. If they were so civilized, instead of divorcing, they are selling the wives by public auction. And that tells you the story, how civilized were the European colonizers, especially Britishers. How, they treated their women. Now, you could say that there was Queen Victoria and all. That's part of the aristocracy. But if you looked down below the nobility, at the common men, the working class population, the treatment of women in British society was not very good. So I think sometimes we have these high notions. Unfortunately, the victors write the history, and their version of history survives. So there were two dimensions of colonization. One is the racial component, second is the religious or cultural component. And in both ways, the colonizers tried to subjugate the original culture. And this has been the story everywhere. In every country where colonization happened, the same two things happened.
Within is just a word, and that is what Professor Rao had asked also. And that is that today, as you go in Australia, you find that all over they are trying to put indigenous people just on their covers, in museums, everywhere. And she was asking, what about New Zealand? And Professor Rao, it's the same in New Zealand. But the fact remains that the structural discrimination still remains. The reality is that although with all that outer visibility of these indigenous people in Australia as well as in New Zealand, because in New Zealand also about Maoris, there's a great deal of effort at the present time to show that they are being treated very appropriately and that they are to be honored. But the reality is that that baggage of history And currently also, with all that discrimination goes on in different kind of ways, socially, economically, politically, and so that continues in both countries.
I think that's a very valid point. And, as a mental health professional or as a psychiatrist, uh, you know, one applies to societal level, there are coping mechanisms and defense mechanisms, and one of them is reaction formation. So there is an inherent guilt in the society about having maltreated certain section of the society. This outward display of bonhomie and being very civilized and egalitarian and inclusive and honoring the diversity is a way of atoning for your original sin, if I may say. So it's only an ostensible reparation for the collective societal guilt you have as a society. Having said that, the same problems are continuing. If you look at New Zealand, it's a very small country with a population of 5.2 million people. The Maori people are only 775,000. But in New Zealand Parliament, there are only 7 Maori people who are nominated. The first past the post system is such that you cannot have Maori people elected to the parliament. It's a unicameral legislature. So there's no way Maori people with, 1:5 abundance of European colonizers in the population, in the voting population, you will ever be able to, by first past the post system, elect Maori lawmakers. So there are only 7 seats reserved in the unicameral legislature of New Zealand, and that speaks for something. I want to bring another aspect. People talk about colonization, Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 and colonization. What is not known is continued colonization to this day. The highest number of migration to New Zealand, highest number, comes from 2 countries. One of them is UK, second is Ireland. So European migration to New Zealand is still the preferred migration to New Zealand, which is disproportionately continuing to increase the European segment of New Zealand population, which stands at 70% at this time. So colonization of Maori lands has not stopped. You cannot have Maori people recolonize New Zealand because they are almost, decimated kind of thing, unless they import some Maori people who are living in Australia. So you are having a demographic invasion by Europeans of New Zealand still continuing in 21st century, and that will continue to make Maori people further minority from 16% to maybe 10% if we see in 20 years' time. And people may not realize a lot of migration is going on from United States of very rich people to New Zealand. People who are fed up of the US strife-driven political system and tax structure. High net worth rich entrepreneurs are moving to New Zealand because they can buy the investor visa into New Zealand system. So it's a preferred place for migration by European people of European origin.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditya ji. That was very revealing. We have very interesting and revealing, information which we never knew. I just, I'm very curious to know about Maoris now than before. But would you name some scholars that have written both pro Maoris and anti-Maoris, or European scholars who write about them, or those who are very sympathetic to them? Would you just mention a few so that I can read more about it?
Before maybe Anushree answers that, Professor Nanda wants to leave. So Professor Nanda, do you have any last minute comments?
No, I was simply going to say that Tinji, you've got plenty of those scholars, but I do have some, so I can send back to Professor Rao.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. My apologies that I've got to leave to the other program again. Thank you. Tinji, my apologies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
So Anushree, do you have any information for Professor Rao?
Yes, Professor.
Again?
Yes, Professor Rao. I have come across certain academics. I have actually enlisted some of their works in the references that I have seen. In the presentation itself, I mentioned this person. I'm just trying to search the name again. So, starting with those who are not per se anti-Maoris, because I haven't actually read their literature in totality, but I have come across many such academics, I must say, who are in a way justifying colonial rule, and who are also in a way justifying how Christianization was the only way forward for Maori. So to me, that in a way is disrespecting Maori culture. One such person that I quoted in my presentation was this anthropologist Elson Best. And then there is a scholar within Maori community. I mentioned that person also. I'll just have to go and get my notes. I'll message you name of that person who is from within the Maori community, who has challenged this kind of viewpoint, citing at what Adityanji had said, the collective psychological trauma that the community has been through, and then making community responsible. I have certain links. I will share that with you if that is okay with you.
Yeah, definitely. Because when they do write about Maori culture, so are there anthropologists, historians who go all over New Zealand and do field work? Are they that sort of scholars, or are they American scholars? I was just interested. Or are they from a country that has already been colonized? Who understand?
The ones that I have come across are certainly, majority of them are anthropologists. A couple of them were historians, and certainly they seem to have a clear bias for the crown. So I'm not sure of their country of origin, but either they were appointed by the crown to conduct their research, or they possibly had their own biases, in my opinion.
I would like to invite other two people who are present in the conference if they have any questions or comments. Ripudaman, do you have any questions or comments? I think you are on mute. You are on mute. Please unmute.
Sorry. Yeah, wonderful presentation, Adityanji. I was just curious about, my question is not directly related to the Maori, but related to the colonization by the Europeans. So first thing is like there, as you mentioned, there is a there has been a template kind of used for the for colonization of various parts of the world by the Europeans, right? So how come the Bible becomes such a powerful tool um, uh, during this process of colonizing? At what point of time? Because earlier, like 500 years back or 600 years back, mostly it was, my understanding is mostly it was by using the war against the that the nation. But at what point of time this soft skill was introduced, and it became so powerful tool?
It's not a soft skill. If you know the story of, Portuguese colonization of Goa and how Christianity was brought,
Portuguese, yes.
you know, how people were forced to adopt Christianity by the colonizers, by Portuguese colonizers. There's a sort of pillar in Goa, which literally means hand cutting pillar. And the natives in Goa were brought to this pillar. They were tied to the pillar and their hands were chopped off by European missionaries, Portuguese missionaries. And that pillar is still standing there as a tourist attraction. Saint Javier or Saint Xavier, whichever way you pronounce him, on whose name there is, this big church, Basilica of Dom Jesus. This Christian missionary was very cruel, to women and children. There were untold atrocities on women. I am not going to talk because I don't want to use violence pornography, but it was despicable things done to women, not only sexual atrocities, but also physical barbarity of cutting organs and things like that. So bringing Bible was not a soft, intervention. It was part of very cruel, abominable, total control of captive population that was militarily not so strong. Now, these are retrospective falsifications that Christianity colonized the natives, the barbarians. And this has been true of all the lands that were colonized by Europeans. So no, it was not done by love or spread of the gospel or whatever. It was done in the most vicious, most brutal manner. The conversion, at least in places like Goa, you have documented history. But in New Zealand, there's no documented history because Maori people did not have a written language, but in Goa, at least there is documentation. How people were forced to eat beef to make them, leave their religion and convert them to Christianity. And these things were done. So no, the Christianity was not spread by the love of Jesus or by love of God or by, soft power, but by very brutal power of subjugation of the culture of the natives. Carl, you have been silent. Do you want to make any comments or observations?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Professor Nalini and Anushree. Definitely very educative. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I was trying to identify trends in Maori human rights at the current time, and there were two trends that I noticed. One is kind of positive, the other is sort of negative. So the positive one was, so recent, am I audible?
You're audible to me, though.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'll just, so, in just recently, a few years back, New Zealand was in the news because uh, they their courts passed a judgment saying that rivers and one particular river had rights just like a human being, and that in fact was the consequence, the end result of a long campaign by a Maori tribe. So it was a Maori tribe that campaigned for the rights of rivers, and they ultimately met with success. So that goes to the credit of the legal system there, and it shows that the Maori view of human rights is slowly making its way into the mainstream discourse, and I hope that trend continues. The second trend that I noticed was there is a tendency amongst the liberal segments in Anglo-settler societies to fetishize indigenous cultures that have been pretty much decimated and colonized before. So that tends to happen in New Zealand also with the Maori symbols and the haka dance and so forth. And that seems to be a continuing trend. There was an important incident a few years back where some particular university frat group, they had this tradition of going to the park, and after a lot of drinking, they do the haka dance. And for many years, the local Maoris were protesting that please don't do this. It's very disrespectful. The haka dance is a sacred dance, and at least try to know more about it. But they were ignored, and year after year, the the farce continued until a few Maori youth came and assaulted the students. And of course, they were taken to court, and they were punished for the assault. But at least that stopped that tradition of using the haka dance. So is violence going to be the only way to get people to sit up and take them seriously and make people understand what is sacred and what is not? So I think that's an important thing. That's an important trend that I'll be closely following with the Maori and with indigenous cultures in other places as well, is the fetishization of their cultures rather than trying to understand their cultures through a true system of discipleship. So that's my second point. Thank you.
I think you have made very excellent points. And with passage of time, when you see your original colonization motive in today's world cannot stand a legal scrutiny. And there are bound to be some changes in all the colonized lands. And you're seeing those kind of things. They are parallel tales about fetishization of the original cultures in lands that were colonized by Europeans. This is again a universal phenomenon. All of us, except for Anushree, are sitting in United States. Our Native American names were fetishized in sports teams. In last 30 years, the movement against them to drop those names, because they were like, I mean, you can say that, we are honoring them, honoring their valor. So you had Cleveland Indians that became Cleveland Guardians, were forced to become by economic boycott. So that answers your next question, that short of physical violence in this today's commercial world, if the market forces, the mercantile forces are strong enough, and that has shown in America, that by putting economic pressure, you can U-turn the disrespectful misappropriation, cultural digestion of native traditions. It's possible in the United States because we are a totally capitalistic society. May not be possible in New Zealand, which is more of a socialist society, a welfare state. I'm not going to advocate violence, but there are degrees of violence, and so one may try to justify that violence by saying that that was in retaliation against the original violence, the original sin of decimation of the population. But at least in today's world, violence is not the answer, but there are other means which may include economic boycotts, which may include cultural shaming and social disapproval, the media is very powerful these days. So other tactics can be used, including legal means, to change the behaviors. But this is a universal problem that the colonizing powers have misappropriated as a token, or for whatever reason, maybe as a victory dance, the symbols of the original civilization. And that is nothing, different in New Zealand. Yes, Haka dance is something that is used now by white New Zealanders very commonly in marriages, in other celebrations, in diplomatic gatherings. So whether that is genuine change of heart, time will tell. Mr. Patel, you are keeping silent. Do you have any questions? Or comments?
I have, well, you have said many things very nicely. I will just share two comments from my side. One, I consider Vatican as a headquarter of factory of God's soldiers. We sent those soldiers all over the world for colonization for millenniums and those things. And I happened to go to Machu Picchu, and for 5 days we had 3 different guides, but from all of them there was the same kind of talk, the how much this Christian came and took away the Peru, took the silver from them and destroy their culture totally. And in fact, he made one comment that this Machu Picchu was hidden in trees in a mountain where these people could not reach. Otherwise, Machu Picchu would have been probably another big church over there. So you could hear the kind of a feeling of regression from the original people of every country in the world. And you put very well about what happened in New Zealand and Australia. I have been to both the countries, and I have seen some of it. We went to see, particularly in Australia, some of the original people spend night over there. So I'm a little bit aware about what was going on there and what's going on today. And so those are my comments. One good part which Mr. Clemens mentioned about rivers have a right. I read about it and I was very happy about that judgment when it came out. That's my comment today.
Thank you, Mr. Patel. So I guess we are coming to the end of this seminar. I thank Anushree. I also thank Professor Rao, and I thank everyone who is present here on a Friday evening. To spend Friday evening on such a topic requires some commitment. So thank you very much indeed. We will have a seminar by Anushree, her last seminar, 2 weeks from now on a Friday evening. So with that, let's end this seminar. The recording will be available on our website within the next 24 hours. So thank you very much indeed. It was a very intellectually stimulating discussion, but it should not remain only at intellectual level. It has to lead to some action to change the situation. Okay. We shall meet in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you all.